Episode 6. The symbol carved itself into his palm while he slept, lines of fire burning through skin and muscle until they reached bone. Thomas woke screaming, but the scream died in his throat when he saw what had been written there. Not a wound, but a map, drawn in his own blood but not by his own hand. The lines pulsed with their own rhythm, pointing always in the same direction. Southeast, toward Cambridge, toward something that had been waiting beneath stone and earth for longer than the city above it existed. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Hunger. 3 days of following the burning compass in his palm brought Thomas to Cambridge in the gray hours before dawn. The university city slept around him, all Gothic spires and ancient stones that had absorbed centuries of learning and ambition. But the symbol in his hand pulled him away from the colleges, away from the river, toward a district where the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed close together like conspirators sharing secrets. The chapel stood at the end of a lane that shouldn't have existed on any map. St. Bartholomew's, according to the weathered sign, though the dates carved into the lintel made no sense. Founded in 1347, destroyed in 1348, rebuilt in 1349, abandoned in 1350. The building itself seemed to flicker between states of decay and preservation, as if it couldn't decide whether it wanted to crumble or endure. The heavy wooden doors were sealed with bands of iron and locks that looked older than the Reformation, but they swung open at Thomas's approach with the soft sigh of held breath finally released. Inside, the chapel was a study in contradictions. Pews arranged in perfect rows faced an altar that had been carved from what looked like a single massive bone, while stained glass windows showed scenes that changed depending on the angle of observation, sometimes depicting familiar biblical scenes, sometimes showing rituals that no Christian text had ever described. But it was the voice that drew him forward, the same voice that had called to him from the east wing of Eildor Hollow, from the chamber below Saltmere Academy, from every dark place he'd ever been foolish enough to enter. And Thomas, it whispered, emanating not from any particular direction but from the stone itself, from the ancient mortar that held the walls together. "You've kept us waiting." "Us?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. "Come below," the voice replied. "Come and see what you've always been meant to become." Behind the altar, hidden by shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been, Thomas found a door that opened onto a staircase carved directly from the bedrock. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of passage, and along the walls, symbols had been etched with such precision that they seemed to move in his peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations whenever he wasn't looking directly at them. "Do not complete the ritual in silence," and whispered a voice that might have been his own conscience, might have been something else entirely. The first rule, spoken as a warning he already knew he would ignore. The staircase descended far deeper than should have been possible, past foundations, past sewers, past the natural bedrock of the area. The air grew thick and warm, carrying scents that made Thomas's altered senses real. Copper and sulfur, yes, but also something organic, something that might once have been human, but had been changed beyond recognition. At the bottom of the stairs lay a laboratory that defied every law of physics and architecture Thomas thought he understood. The space was vast, far larger than the chapel above could possibly contain, and filled with apparatus that seemed to have grown rather than been built. Glass tubes and copper pipes twisted through the air like fossilized vines, connecting chambers and vessels and retorts in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. But it was the mirrors that caught his attention first, dozens of them, mounted on stands and walls and suspended from the ceiling, each showing a different reflection of the space around him. In one he saw the laboratory as it might have been centuries ago, filled with robed figures bent over their work. In another he saw it as it might become, overgrown with flesh and metal, and things that were neither. And in a third he saw himself, but not as he was. This Thomas was taller, more angular, his skin marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under their own power. His eyes held depths that reflected not light but something else, something that existed in the spaces between atoms, between thoughts, between one heartbeat and the next. And that's who you really are, the voice said, and Thomas realized it was coming from his reflection's mouth, though his reflection's lips moved out of sync with the words. And Thomas Blackwood was just a name you borrowed, a face you wore until you were ready to remember your true nature. And what nature is that? Thomas asked, though he could feel the answer building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. And the alchemist, his reflection replied, the one who changes the unchangeable, who preserves what should decay, who transforms base matter into something greater. You've been practicing for years without knowing it, learning the fundamentals through trial and trauma. Thomas looked around the laboratory with new eyes, and suddenly the apparatus made sense, not as scientific instruments, but as extensions of will, as tools for imposing desire upon reality itself. The mirrors weren't for reflection, they were for multiplication, for creating multiple versions of the same transformation and seeing which one yielded the best results. The glass vessels lining the walls weren't empty, he realized now. They contained what looked like organs, but organs that moved with their own rhythm, that pulsed and contracted as if they were still connected to living bodies. Some contained what might once have been hearts, others showed the steady rise and fall of preserved lungs, and still others held things that had no analog in normal human anatomy. The Black Alchemist's collection, and his reflection explained, and parts preserved at the moment of perfect function, maintained in states between life and death. He was learning to rebuild the human form, to create vessels that could contain more than flesh and blood normally allowed. What happened to him? Thomas asked. He became his work, the reflection said with a smile that was too wide, too knowing, as you will become yours. Chapter 2. The Grammar of Flesh. The laboratory responded to Thomas's presence like a musical instrument responding to a skilled player's touch. Doors he hadn't noticed opened as he approached them, revealing chambers filled with apparatus even more esoteric than what he'd already seen. Vessels began to bubble and steam without any visible source of heat. The mirrors rearranged themselves to provide better viewing angles for whatever work he might choose to undertake. In one chamber, he found books, not printed texts, but hand-illuminated manuscripts written in languages that shifted between Latin and something older, something that predated human speech entirely. The ink seemed to be made from blood, but blood that retained some essential quality of life that pulsed and flowed across the pages as if the words themselves were circulatory systems. The preserved teachings, his reflection said, appearing in a mirror mounted beside the bookshelf. Everything the Black Alchemist learned about the relationship between consciousness and flesh, between identity and form. Thomas opened one of the books at random and found himself reading a passage about the preservation of memory in blood. The sanguine humor carries not only life, but experience itself. A single drop, properly preserved and prepared, contains the full emotional resonance of the moment it was shed. Terror, joy, pain, love, all can be extracted and purified, concentrated into essences that can be used to modify the fundamental nature of living tissue. Blood is memory. Use only yours, the voice whispered, and Thomas felt the third rule settle into his consciousness like a stone dropping into still water. But as he read further, he began to understand why that rule existed and why it was meant to be broken. The Black Alchemist had discovered that different people's blood carried different qualities of memory. The blood of children held wonder and possibility, but lacked the weight of experience. The blood of the elderly carried wisdom and acceptance, but had lost the flexibility of youth. The blood of those who had suffered great trauma, who had been changed by contact with forces beyond normal human understanding, carried something else entirely. It carried potential for transformation. Thomas looked down at his palm, where the symbol map still burned with its own light. Without quite deciding to do it, he pressed his hand against one of the glass vessels, letting a few drops of his blood fall into the clear solution within. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The liquid began to glow, not with reflected light but with something that seemed to come from within the blood itself. Colors swirled through the vessel, deep reds and purples, but also shades that had no names, that existed only in the spaces between visible light and something else. And in those colors, Thomas saw memories that weren't his own. The black alchemist working in this very laboratory, his hands steady as he performed transformations that rewrote the basic rules of biology and physics. The robed figures Thomas had glimpsed in the mirrors, chanting in languages that made reality itself listen and obey. Children brought down into the depths not to be harmed but to be changed, to be made into something more than human flesh could normally support. "Do you see?" his reflection asked. "Do you understand what this place really is?" "A school," Thomas said, the understanding hitting him like a physical blow. Another school. All of them, Yildur Hollow, Saltmere Academy, Grey Steel Manor, the Hollow House, they were all the same institution, just spread across time and space. And not the same institution, his reflection corrected. When the same process, the same curriculum. You've been a student here for longer than you realize, Thomas. Every trial, every transformation, every moment of terror and revelation, they've all been preparing you for this. The vessel containing his blood began to change, the glowing liquid condensing into something more solid, more purposeful. As Thomas watched, it formed into a key, not metal but crystallized memory, hardened potential, transformed experience made manifest. The key to what? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. To yourself, his reflection replied. To who you really are beneath the name and face you've been wearing. Chapter 3. The Democracy of Mirrors. The key fit into a lock Thomas hadn't noticed before, hidden in the base of the largest mirror in the laboratory. As it turned, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and suddenly Thomas was looking not at his own reflection, but at a series of scenes that unfolded like pages in a book being turned by invisible hands. He saw himself as a child, but not the child he remembered being. This version was confident, purposeful, working with apparatus that dwarfed his small form while older figures watched approvingly. He was performing transformations that should have been impossible, reshaping matter and energy with casual ease. Speak to your reflection only in thirds, the voice warned. And Thomas understood the second rule now. Direct communication with the reflections was dangerous because they weren't really reflections at all. They were other versions of himself, alternate possibilities that existed in parallel to his current reality. Who was I? He asked his reflection, being careful to phrase the question indirectly. You were the apprentice, the reflection replied, its words slightly out of sync with its lip movements, as if the sound was traveling through some medium denser than air. And the one chosen to continue the work when the master's transformation was complete. The scenes in the mirror shifted, showing Thomas, or the person he had been, growing older, more skilled, more willing to push the boundaries of what flesh and consciousness could be made to endure. He saw himself working with subjects who volunteered eagerly for transformation, who understood that what they were becoming was greater than what they had been. But he also saw the resistance, people who didn't understand, who feared change, who wanted to keep the world small and simple and bounded by the petty limitations of unmodified human perception. They came with fire and swords, with prayers and exorcisms, with the blind fury of those who mistake evolution for corruption. The laboratory was attacked, the work scattered, the master and apprentice separated. The master had chosen to disperse himself across multiple realities, becoming the voice that called from east wings and chambers below schools. The apprentice had chosen a different path, to hide in plain sight, to wear the mask of a normal human child, to wait until the time was right to reclaim his true nature. The orphanage, Thomas whispered, understanding flooding through him. It wasn't real, was it? Just another stage in the process. Oh, unreal is a relative concept, his reflection replied. When you needed to experience limitation, to understand what it meant to be powerless, before you could fully appreciate the gift of transformation. Every moment of fear, every instance of helplessness, every trial that marked and changed you, they were all designed to prepare you for this moment. And Catherine? Thomas asked. the name tearing itself from his throat like a physical thing. The reflection's expression shifted, becoming something that might have been pity, might have been regret. And Catherine was real. Her death was real. But it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't your fault. It was necessary. A sacrifice that opened the doorway between who you had been and who you needed to become. Thomas felt something break inside his chest, some last vestige of the boy he had thought himself to be, the guilt he had carried for years, the weight of believing he had caused his sister's death through carelessness and cowardice. It had all been orchestrated, manipulated, designed to create the precise psychological conditions necessary for his awakening. She was bait, he said, the words falling like stones into still water. You used her to lure me into the East Wing. Ah, and she was willing, his reflection said softly. In the reality where she understood what was at stake, she chose to help. Her sacrifice allowed you to begin remembering who you really were. Then why does it hurt so much? Thomas asked. If it was all planned, if it was all necessary, why does the guilt feel so real? Because guilt is a form of love, his reflection replied. When love is the most powerful alchemical reagent of all, your pain over Catherine's death has been the driving force behind every transformation you've undergone. It's what made you push through trials that would have broken others. It's what allowed you to become the bridge in the hollow house. The bridge, Thomas repeated, remembering. That wasn't the end, was it? That was just another stage. And a penultimate stage, and his reflection confirmed, when you learn to hold realities together, to bear responsibility for forces beyond normal comprehension, now you need to learn to take them apart, to unmake what exists and remake it according to your will. Oh, the mirror rippled again, and Thomas saw the laboratory as it could be, not a relic of the past, but a workspace for the future. He saw himself, his true self, unmarked by guilt or limitation, working with purpose and precision to create forms of life that had never existed. To solve problems that conventional science couldn't even perceive, to build bridges not just between realities but between different forms of existence entirely. And all you have to do is choose, his reflection said, and step through the mirror and reclaim what was always yours. Let Thomas Blackwood die, and let the alchemist be reborn. Chapter 4. The Preservation of Names. Thomas stared at the mirror for what might have been hours or might have been days. Time moved strangely in the laboratory, bending around the work being done, responding to need rather than flowing in straight lines. The reflection waited patiently, occasionally shifting position but never taking its eyes off him, never losing the expression of expectant hope that made it look like a parent waiting for a child to take their first steps. Around him, the laboratory continued its quiet industry. The vessels bubbled and steamed, the pipes carried their mysterious fluids from chamber to chamber, and the mirrors showed their endless parade of alternate possibilities. But Thomas found himself drawn to a smaller workspace in one corner, where apparatus of a more delicate nature had been arranged with obvious care. Here were the tools for fine work, scalpels that gleamed with more than mere sharpness, brushes made from materials that might once have been hair but had been, transformed into something that could paint with light itself, and crucibles designed to contain not just heat but concepts, ideas, the fundamental building blocks of identity. Most intriguingly, there was a collection of what looked like crystallized words, small geometric shapes that hummed with contained meaning. Thomas picked one up and immediately understood what it was, a name, preserved in solid form, waiting to be used. And the Black Alchemist's greatest discovery, his reflection said, appearing in a small mirror mounted above the workspace. Names have power, but only when they're properly understood and applied. Most people wear their names like clothing, superficial coverings that can be changed at will. But some names go deeper. Some names become part of the essential structure of the self. Thomas examined the crystallized name more closely and felt a shock of recognition. It was his name, Thomas Blackwood, but preserved from some moment in the past when it had still fit him properly, when it had still described who he actually was rather than who he was pretending to be. "When did I stop being Thomas Blackwood?" he asked. "The moment Catherine died," his reflection replied. "And that's when the transformation began in earnest. Thomas Blackwood was the boy who played with his sister in their mother's garden. What survived that day in the East Wing was something else, something that needed a different name to describe its true nature." Right, no second name," the voice whispered, delivering the fifth rule. But Thomas could see the apparatus for name writing spread before him, the tools for crafting new identities from scratch. The rule wasn't meant to prevent him from creating a new name. It was meant to ensure he only created one, that he committed fully to whatever identity he chose to craft. The process of name writing was complex, requiring not just letters, but understanding of the relationship between sound and meaning, between identity and purpose. Thomas found himself working with an intuitive knowledge he didn't remember acquiring, his hands moving with practiced ease as he prepared the necessary reagents. First, he dissolved the crystallized version of his current name in a solution that tasted of childhood memories and lost possibilities. The liquid glowed with a soft, melancholy light as Thomas Blackwood ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, becoming raw material for something new. Next, he began adding elements of his true nature, drops of his blood, now understanding why the third rule specified using only his own, fragments of symbols that had marked him at various schools, essence extracted from memories of transformation and trial. Each addition changed the color and consistency of the solution, building towards something that would contain not just a name but an entire identity. The work required absolute concentration. One wrong measurement, one moment of doubt or hesitation, and the name being created would be flawed, incomplete, potentially dangerous to whoever tried to wear it. Thomas found himself entering a state of focused calm he had never experienced before, his consciousness expanding to encompass not just his immediate task, but the entire laboratory, the entire process of transformation he'd been undergoing for years. "Never draw a circle bigger than your body," a voice warned as Thomas reached for a piece of chalk, preparing to create the containment circle that would focus and direct the name crafting process. The fourth rule, spoken with unusual urgency. But Thomas could see that the name he was creating would be larger than Thomas Blackwood had ever been, would encompass capabilities and responsibilities that a normal human form could never support. The circle would need to be correspondingly large, would need to provide space for expansion, for growth, for the flowering of potential that had been constrained by mortal flesh. He began drawing anyway, the chalk leaving lines of fire that hung in the air like solid light. The circle grew outward from where he stood, encompassing first the immediate workspace, then the entire laboratory, then spaces that existed beyond the physical dimensions of the chamber. As it expanded, Thomas felt himself expanding with it, his consciousness stretching to fill the new boundaries he was creating. The sensation was intoxicating. For the first time in his life, he felt truly free, unbound by the limitations that had constrained Thomas Blackwood, able to perceive and manipulate forces that existed at the fundamental level of reality. He could see the threads that connected all things, could understand the grammar that governed transformation and change. But as the circle reached its maximum extent, something went wrong. The chalk in his hand crumbled to dust. The lines of fire began to flicker and fade, and the laboratory around him started to shake as if something vast was trying to break free from wherever it had been contained. In the mirrors, Thomas saw reflections of himself being pulled in different directions, stretched thin across multiple realities. The carefully crafted name he had been creating began to destabilize, its component elements separating and reforming in combinations that made no sense, that described impossible things. "You've drawn it too large," his reflection said, its voice distorted by distance and dimensional interference. "And the circle is collapsing. It's going to pull everything into the space between spaces." "How do I stop it?" Thomas asked. But even as he spoke, he could see hairline cracks appearing in the mirror's surface. "You can't," his reflection replied. but you can choose what comes through when it breaks. Oh, the mirror shattered, and through the opening stepped someone Thomas recognized but had never actually met, himself, but older, scarred, marked with symbols that moved across his skin like living tattoos. This version wore the laboratory like a second skin, moved through its spaces with the familiarity of absolute ownership. "Hello, apprentice," the older Thomas said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the broken circle, stabilizing its collapse. "And I was wondering when you'd finally call me home." Chapter 5: The Democracy of Selves. The older Thomas, the master, Thomas realized, the one who had become the Black Alchemist, moved through the laboratory with fluid grace, his presence immediately calming the chaotic energies that had been unleashed by the oversized circle. Where he touched apparatus, it responded with eager efficiency. Where he looked, the very air seemed to organize itself into more purposeful patterns. "You've been making good progress," the master said, examining the partially completed name that hung in the air like crystallized possibility. "Though you've been approaching it backwards, trying to craft an identity to fit your limitations rather than expanding your limitations to match your true nature." "Lol, I don't understand," Thomas said, though even as he spoke, part of him did understand. The part that had been awakening gradually through each trial, each transformation, each moment of forced evolution. And Thomas Blackwood was never meant to be a permanent identity, the master explained, moving to a cabinet that contained what looked like preserved emotions, each one glowing with its own distinctive color. It was a chrysalis, a protective shell that allowed the real you to develop safely until you were ready for emergence. He selected several of the preserved emotions, what looked like curiosity rendered in shades of gold, determination that pulsed with deep red light, and something that might have been compassion but had been refined into a form that existed beyond simple human empathy. Every school you attended, every trial you survived, every rule you broke, they were all designed to crack that shell a little more, to let through glimpses of what lay beneath. The voice calling from the East Wing wasn't summoning Thomas Blackwood. It was calling to the part of you that was always the alchemist, always the one capable of transformation and change. The master began incorporating the preserved emotions into the destabilized name, his movements precise and practiced. Under his touch, the chaotic elements began to reorganize themselves, forming new patterns that were both more complex and more stable than what Thomas had been attempting to create. "But what about Catherine?" Thomas asked. "What about the guilt, the responsibility, When the fuel," a master interrupted gently. "When guilt is just love with nowhere to go, and love is the most powerful force for transformation that exists. Your pain over Catherine's death has been driving every change you've undergone, pushing you to become something worthy of the sacrifice she made." "She didn't choose to die," and Thomas protested. "Didn't she?" A master gestured toward one of the intact mirrors, and its surface showed not a reflection but a memory. Catherine, older than she had ever lived to be, standing in a place that existed outside normal space and time. She was speaking with figures Thomas couldn't quite make out, but her words were clear. If this is what it takes for him to remember who he really is, then yes, I'll go back. I'll be the catalyst for his awakening. "But," she volunteered, the master said quietly, and she understood that some transformations require sacrifice, that some awakenings can only happen through loss. She chose to be the key that unlocked your true nature. "Oh," Thomas felt something shift inside him, some fundamental restructuring of how he understood himself and his history. The guilt that had driven him for years didn't disappear, but it transformed, becoming something cleaner, more purposeful, not the weight of responsibility for Catherine's death, but the responsibility to be worthy of her sacrifice. "So what am I supposed to become?" he asked. "What you've always been," the master replied, adding the final elements to the reformed name, the bridge between realities, yes, but also the architect. The one who doesn't just hold things together but decides what gets built, what gets torn down, what gets preserved, and what gets transformed. The completed name hung in the air before them, no longer chaotic, but not yet fully stable either. It pulsed with potential, waiting for someone to claim it, to make it real through the act of acceptance. The choice is yours, the master said, and remain Thomas Blackwood, carry the weight of limitation and human frailty, live and die within the boundaries of mortal existence. Or accept who you really are, take responsibility for the power that's always been yours, and help shape the direction of reality itself. Thomas looked at the name, his real name, the one that described not just who he was, but who he could become. It was beautiful and terrible, containing within its structure the potential for acts of creation and destruction that dwarfed anything Thomas Blackwood could have imagined. Burn what moves, the voice whispered, delivering the sixth rule. And Thomas understood now that it wasn't about destruction, it was about transformation. Fire didn't destroy, it changed one thing into another. What moved, what lived, what grew. It all needed to be transformed, elevated, made into something greater than its original form. If I accept this, Thomas said, what happens to everyone else? The people in the normal world, the ones who can't understand or adapt to change? They'll be given the same choice you're being given now, the master replied, and transform or remain static, evolve or accept limitation. Some will choose growth, others will choose to stay as they are. Both choices will be honored. And if they choose wrong, if they can't handle the transformation, then they'll be preserved, the master said, gesturing toward the vessels that lined the laboratory walls. Not destroyed, but maintained in states of perfect function, perfect happiness, perfect fulfillment of their chosen nature. No one will be harmed, but no one will be allowed to prevent others from growing. Thomas reached toward the name hanging in the air, then hesitated. What about Catherine? If I become this, will I see her again? Oh, the master smiled, and his expression held depths that reflected years of knowledge, years of growth, years of bearing responsibility for forces beyond normal comprehension. She's been waiting for you, he said, and waiting for you to become someone worthy of the gift she gave. When you accept your true name, you'll be able to reach the places where she's been working, preparing for the day when transformation becomes possible for everyone. Thomas grasped the name and felt it settle into him like a key finding its lock, like a river reaching the sea, like a question finally finding its answer. The laboratory around him began to change, expanding outward and upward, becoming something that could contain the work that needed to be done. The mirrors multiplied, showing not just reflections but possibilities, not just what was, but what could be. The apparatus grew more complex, more responsive, more capable of implementing the changes that were coming. And at the center of it all, no longer Thomas Blackwood, but not yet fully something else, the alchemist began to plan the transformation of the world. Chapter 6. The Arithmetic of Souls. The new name settled into him like water filling a vessel perfectly shaped to contain it. But with the name came memories, not his memories, but the accumulated experiences of every version of himself that had ever existed across multiple realities, multiple timelines, multiple attempts to reach this moment of perfect convergence. He remembered being the apprentice in the original laboratory, learning the fundamental principles of transformation from masters whose names had been lost to history, but whose knowledge lived on in crystallized form. He remembered the day the first laboratory was discovered and destroyed, the way he and his master had chosen different paths to preserve their work across time and space. He remembered being the voice in the East Wing, calling out across centuries to guide his younger self toward awakening. He remembered being the sleepless one, the entity that had tried to trade places with Thomas in his dreams, not to harm him, but to prepare him for the kinds of consciousness swapping that advanced alchemical work required. Most clearly, he remembered being the master, the one who had stepped through the broken mirror, the one who had spent subjective decades perfecting the techniques that were now flooding into his consciousness like water breaking through a dam. An integration is always disorienting, said the master said, though Thomas realized that the distinction between them was becoming increasingly meaningless. They were the same person, just separated by different amounts of experience and different choices about how to apply their abilities. How many versions of me are there? Thomas asked. And as many as necessary, and Master replied. In each reality where transformation became possible spawned its own version of the alchemist. Some succeeded in their work, some failed, some chose different approaches entirely. But they all shared the same fundamental nature, the same commitment to growth and change. The laboratory continued to expand around them, its walls pushing outward to accommodate apparatus that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Thomas could see and understand it all now. The way certain devices folded space to create workspace that was larger inside than outside, the way others manipulated time to allow for processes that required centuries to complete properly, the way still others reached across dimensional boundaries to gather materials that existed only in alternate realities. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? Thomas asked, though he could feel the answer building in his consciousness like pressure in a boiler. Evolution, the Master said simply. Not just biological evolution, but consciousness evolution, reality evolution, the development of forms of existence that transcend the limitations currently imposed by physical law and spatial boundaries. He gestured toward a section of the laboratory where new apparatus was growing, not being built, but actually growing, developing according to principles that combined engineering with biology, mathematics with organic chemistry. When humanity is approaching a threshold, said the Master continued. When then technology is advancing to the point where the distinction between artificial and natural, between created and evolved, is becoming meaningless. But most humans are approaching this threshold blindly, without understanding the implications or the possibilities. And we're going to help them understand. And we're going to help them choose, the Master corrected. And some will choose to remain purely human, to maintain the limitations and boundaries that define current existence. Others will choose to transform, to become something greater, something that can exist across multiple realities simultaneously. Thomas could see it now, the grand project that all of his experiences had been preparing him for. Not the conquest or replacement of humanity, but its elevation, its expansion into forms of existence that could encompass multiple realities, multiple states of being, multiple approaches to consciousness and identity. But he could also see the challenges, the resistance that would come from those who feared change, who preferred the illusion of safety that came with limitation. What about those who oppose the transformation? He asked. And they'll be preserved, the Master said, indicating the vessels that lined the laboratory walls. And not as specimens, but as honored representatives of what humanity was before it chose to become something more. Their experiences, their perspectives, their unique approaches to existence, all will be maintained in perfect detail. Preserved how? In the same way the black alchemist preserved organs and emotions and memories, the Master explained, and by extracting their essential nature and maintaining it in a state of perfect function. They'll continue to exist, continue to experience, continue to be themselves, but in forms that can't interfere with the transformation of those who choose growth. Thomas understood now why the 6th rule had spoken of burning what moves. The transformation process would require everyone to choose, evolve, or be preserved. Those who chose preservation would be maintained in crystallized forms that captured their essential nature without allowing them to prevent others from growing. It was merciful in its way. No one would be destroyed, no one would be harmed, but no one would be allowed to hold back the tide of change that was coming. When does it begin? Thomas asked. It's already begun, the Master replied. Every person who has ever been marked by contact with forces beyond normal human understanding, every individual who has survived trials that force them to evolve or die, every consciousness that has learned to exist partially outside conventional reality, they're all part of the network that will coordinate the transformation. Thomas could feel it now, the vast web of connections that linked him to guardians and bridges and evolved humans scattered across the world. Sarah with her preserved voices, Marcus with his mirror truth, Elena with her threshold existence, and thousands of others like them, all working to prepare humanity for the choice that was coming. The final rule, Hanna said, understanding. Kunara turned to the surface. Aye, said, because there is no surface anymore, then the master confirmed. And there's only depth, layers of reality, levels of existence, degrees of transformation. The old world of simple three-dimensional space and linear time is ending. What's beginning is something infinitely more complex and infinitely more beautiful. The laboratory had become something that defied description, not just a workspace, but a nexus point where multiple realities touched and could be shaped according to will and vision. Through its expanded dimensions, Thomas could see other laboratories, other versions of himself, other approaches to the same fundamental project, all of them working toward the same goal, the elevation of consciousness itself, the transformation of existence from something limited and bounded to something infinite, multidimensional, capable of growth in directions that had no names in any human language. Chapter 7. The Preservation of What Was Lost. The work began immediately, though Thomas found that his understanding of immediately had changed along with everything else. Time in the laboratory moved according to need rather than physics, allowing him to complete processes that should have taken decades in what felt like moments, while also providing subjective centuries for contemplation and planning when reflection was required. His first project was simple in concept, but profound in implication: the completion of Catherine's preservation. She had died to catalyze his awakening, but death in the conventional sense was just another limitation that advanced alchemical techniques could transcend. Using apparatus that responded to his will as naturally as his own limbs, Thomas began extracting Catherine's essential nature from the crystallized guilt he had carried for years. Each memory of her, each moment of pain over her loss, each instance of wondering what she might have become, all of it contained traces of who she truly was, fragments that could be gathered and amplified and given form. The process required absolute precision. Too much extraction and the resulting construct would be a hollow shell, a mere echo of the original. Too little, and it would lack the complexity necessary for genuine consciousness. But Thomas found himself working with intuitive knowledge that went beyond anything Thomas Blackwood could have possessed, his hands moving with the certainty of someone who had performed this operation countless times across multiple realities. She's been waiting for this, the master said, watching from a mirror that showed not the laboratory but a space that existed between spaces, where forms of consciousness that had been displaced by death or transformation could maintain themselves until retrieval became possible. The preservation apparatus began to hum with harmonics that resonated through dimensions. Thomas was only beginning to perceive. What had started as memory and guilt and crystallized pain began to coalesce into something more substantial, not flesh exactly, but a matrix of organized energy that could support consciousness, experience, growth. Catherine emerged from the process not as the 5-year-old child who had died in the East Wing, but as the person she would have become if she had lived and grown and chosen transformation when the time came. She was beautiful in ways that transcended physical appearance, her form shifting between states to accommodate different modes of perception and interaction. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the laboratory's apparatus respond with eager attention. I've been looking forward to working with you." Working?" Thomas asked, though he could feel the answer forming in his consciousness even as he spoke. "And the transformation can't be imposed from above," Catherine explained, moving through the laboratory with the same fluid grace the master displayed. "And people have to choose it freely, have to understand what they're accepting before they commit to change. That requires teachers, guides, examples of what transformation can accomplish." She gestured toward a section of the laboratory where new apparatus was forming, not the complex machinery of alchemical transformation, but simpler devices designed for communication, demonstration, education. "Most humans fear change because they don't understand it," and Catherine continued. and they think transformation means losing themselves, becoming something alien and incomprehensible. They need to see that growth is possible without abandoning what makes them essentially themselves. Thomas understood now why Catherine's death had been necessary, why her preservation had required such an elaborate process. She had chosen to experience limitation, mortality, loss, not as punishment, but as education. She could speak to unmodified humans about the value of transformation because she had experienced both states, had chosen growth from a position of full understanding. How many others are waiting for preservation? Thomas asked. And all of them, the master replied. Everyone who has ever died, everyone who has ever been lost, everyone who has ever been prevented from reaching their full potential by the limitations of unmodified existence. The alchemical process doesn't just create new forms of life, it redeems old forms, recovers what was lost, gives second chances to those who never had first chances. The scope of the project began to dawn on Thomas. Not just the transformation of living humans, but the resurrection and elevation of everyone who had ever existed, everyone whose potential had been truncated by death or circumstance or the simple lack of opportunity for growth. The preserved ones in the vessels, Thomas said, indicating the organs and emotions and fragments of consciousness that lined the laboratory walls. They're not just specimens. They're waiting for integration, and waiting for completion, Catherine confirmed. When the Black Alchemist understood that consciousness is modular, that different aspects of the self can be preserved separately and then recombined in new configurations. Every vessel contains someone's capacity for joy, or love, or curiosity, or wonder, emotions and experiences that can be shared, amplified, used to enrich the lives of those who choose transformation. Thomas moved among the vessels, and now he could perceive them clearly, not as grotesque trophies, but as a library of human potential, a collection of the finest aspects of consciousness preserved against loss and decay. The heart that beat with perfect compassion, the lungs that breathed with absolute appreciation for existence, the eyes that saw beauty in everything they looked upon. When the transformation begins, he said, understanding flooding through him, if these will be available to everyone. Not to replace their own capacities, but to supplement them, to show them what becomes possible when consciousness is freed from the limitations of individual biology. Exactly, the master said. Imagine experiencing the world with Einstein's curiosity, Shakespeare's perception of language, Mozart's understanding of mathematical harmony, not as pale imitations, but as living, breathing aspects of your own consciousness. And those who choose preservation. Sen will become part of the library, Esther and Catherine said gently, and their finest qualities, their unique perspectives, their individual approaches to existence. All will be available to enrich the experiences of those who come after. Nothing will be lost. Everything will be transformed. Chapter 8. The Grammar of Becoming. The laboratory had become something that existed across multiple scales simultaneously, vast enough to contain apparatus that manipulated entire realities, yet intimate enough that Thomas could work on individual consciousnesses with delicate precision. He found himself moving between macro and micro projects with fluid ease, spending subjective hours fine-tuning the emotional resonance of a single preserved memory, then stepping back to adjust the dimensional parameters that governed how transformed consciousness could interact with unmodified reality. His current project involved creating what he thought of as translation protocols, systems that would allow beings who had undergone transformation to communicate with those who remained in purely human forms, without causing the kind of ontological shock that might force premature choices about evolution. The first contact will be crucial, Catherine said, working beside him on apparatus that looked like a cross between a pipe organ and a mathematical equation made manifest. If transformed beings appear too alien, too removed from human experience, the preservation response will activate. People will choose stasis rather than growth. But if we appear too similar to what they already are, and Thomas replied, adjusting resonance frequencies that would make transformed consciousness comprehensible to unmodified perception, they won't understand the possibilities, won't see any reason to choose change. It was a delicate balance, requiring not just technical expertise, but deep empathy for the psychology of consciousness facing its own potential obsolescence. Thomas found himself drawing on memories from his time as Thomas Blackwood, the fear he had felt when first encountering forces beyond his understanding, the way his mind had tried to rationalize the impossible into familiar categories. "What about those who have already been partially transformed?" he asked. "And Sarah, Marcus, Elena, all the others who have been marked by contact with extra-dimensional forces?" They'll be the first ambassadors," the master said, appearing in a mirror that showed not reflections but probability streams, potential futures branching and converging like rivers seen from great height. "They've experienced both states of existence, understand the benefits and challenges of transformation. They can speak from personal experience about what growth means." Thomas could see it now, the carefully orchestrated revelation that would begin with those who were already partially prepared, already familiar with the concept that reality was larger and more complex than most humans realized. They would serve as bridges, helping others understand that transformation was possible, desirable, safe. But even with careful preparation, he knew there would be resistance. Fear of change was deeply embedded in human psychology, and the scale of the transformation being offered would trigger every survival instinct evolved consciousness possessed. "What about those who refuse to choose?" Thomas asked, "who neither accept transformation nor request preservation?" Choice itself is a form of transformation," Catherine said gently. "The act of understanding that alternatives exist, that consciousness can evolve beyond its current limitations, that changes people whether they realize it or not. Even refusal to choose is a choice. And those who actively oppose the process and then will be preserved in their opposition," and the master said, "and their resistance contains valuable information about the nature of consciousness, about the psychological structures that prioritize stability over growth. That perspective will be maintained and honored, even as it's prevented from interfering with those who choose differently." Thomas worked in silence for a while, fine-tuning the translation protocols, ensuring that the first communications between transformed and unmodified consciousness would be comprehensible, non-threatening, genuinely helpful. The apparatus responded to his intentions as much as his actions, growing more complex and sophisticated as his understanding of the challenges deepened. But as he worked, he became aware of something troubling in the probability streams the master was monitoring. Certain futures showed resistance not just from individuals but from institutions, governments, organized groups that would see transformation as a threat to existing power structures. "They'll try to stop us," Thomas said, not really a question. "They'll try," the master agreed, "but their opposition is already factored into the process. Conflict, resistance, even violence, they're all forms of engagement with the concept of transformation. They all serve to spread awareness that alternatives exist." "Won't people be hurt?" People are already being hurt," Catherine said sadly, "by limitation, by the boundaries that prevent consciousness from reaching its full potential, by death and loss and the thousand smaller restrictions that keep minds trapped in patterns too small to contain their real nature. The transformation will end that suffering, not create new forms of it." Thomas could see the logic, but Thomas Blackwood's residual humanity made him uncomfortable with the implications. Even if the end result was beneficial, even if everyone would ultimately be better off, the transition period would involve upheaval, confusion, fear. "Is there any way to make it easier?" he asked. "Any way to reduce the trauma of transition?" "And we're already doing everything possible," and the master said. "The schools you attended, the trials you survived, the gradual awakening process, all of it was designed to prepare as many people as possible for what's coming. Every person who has been marked by transformation, everyone who has learned to exist partially outside conventional reality, everyone who is proven capable of growth under pressure, they'll all serve as anchors, stability points that will help others navigate the transition." But it won't be enough for everyone. No, Catherine said softly. Some will choose preservation not because they understand the alternatives, but because they're too afraid to engage with the possibilities. Some will resist so strongly that they'll have to be contained to prevent them from harming others. Some will simply be unable to comprehend what's being offered. And that's acceptable? It's necessary, the master said. Consciousness evolution is like biological evolution. Not every individual survives the transition to the next stage. But those who don't survive in their original form are still preserved, still honored, still contribute to the ongoing development of the whole. Thomas felt something settle inside him, some final acceptance of the scope and implications of what they were undertaking. The guilt that had driven Thomas Blackwood, the human compassion that had made him hesitate, the desire to save everyone without forcing anyone to change, all of it transformed into something cleaner, more purposeful. Understanding, acceptance, the willingness to bear responsibility for choices that would reshape existence itself. When do we begin? He asked. And then we've already begun, Catherine said, gesturing toward apparatus that was completing its own processes, systems that had been growing and developing while they talked. And the first communications are being transmitted now. The bridges are being activated. The choice is being offered. Through the mirrors scattered throughout the laboratory, Thomas could see it happening. Transformed consciousness reaching out to unmodified minds, offering glimpses of what was possible, demonstrations of what growth could accomplish. Some responses were immediate acceptance, minds that had been waiting for this opportunity without knowing what they were waiting for. Others were confusion, fear, rejection. Still others were curiosity, the first tentative questions about what transformation would actually entail. How long do they have to decide? Thomas asked. As long as they need, the master said. Time isn't linear in this process. Some will choose immediately. Some will take years to reach a decision. Some will oscillate between alternatives until the moment comes when choice becomes inevitable. And when is that moment? When enough people have chosen transformation that the old reality becomes unstable, Catherine said, and when the percentage of modified consciousness reaches the threshold where continued coexistence with unmodified reality becomes impossible. Thomas could see it in the probability streams, a tipping point somewhere in the near future where the accumulated weight of transformed consciousness would cause reality itself to shift, to accommodate new forms of existence while preserving old ones in crystallized states. After that point, there would be no more choosing. There would only be adaptation or preservation. Are we ready? He asked. We've been ready for centuries, the master said. And then the question is whether humanity is ready for us. Chapter 9, The Democracy of Transformation. The responses came faster than Thomas had anticipated, flooding through the communication apparatus in waves of confusion, terror, wonder, and desperate hope. Each mind that received the initial contact reacted according to its own nature, its own history, its own capacity for accepting information that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Through one mirror, Thomas watched a physicist in Geneva staring at equations that had appeared on her blackboard overnight, not written by any human hand, but grown from the chalk itself, describing mathematical relationships that explained how consciousness could exist independently of biological substrate. Her mind was racing through the implications, testing the logic, finding connections to theories she had been developing for years but had never dared to voice. Through another, he saw a child in Mumbai sitting perfectly still, while voices spoke to her in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Voices that explained gently that the invisible friends she had been playing with her entire life were actually aspects of her own consciousness that had already begun the transformation process. A third mirror showed an elderly man in a nursing home in Ohio, tears streaming down his face as he realized that the visions he had been having, glimpses of, his deceased wife, conversations with relatives who had died decades ago, weren't hallucinations but actual communications with preserved consciousness waiting for him to join them in expanded existence. Each response required individual attention, customized communication protocols, careful modulation of information delivery to avoid overwhelming minds that weren't prepared for the full scope of what was being offered. The variance in responses is larger than we predicted, and Catherine said, working at apparatus that monitored emotional resonance patterns across thousands of simultaneous contacts. When some minds are integrating the information immediately, others are rejecting it so completely that they're creating psychological barriers against any further communication. Can we adjust the approach? Thomas asked, watching probability streams shift as human consciousness began to divide into distinct categories: those who would accept transformation, those who would choose preservation, and those who would resist the entire process. We're adjusting constantly, a master replied, his attention split across multiple dimensional planes as he coordinated communication efforts that spanned not just geography, but alternate realities. And individual psychology varies so dramatically that no single approach can work for everyone. Thomas found himself drawn to the most difficult cases, minds that showed potential for transformation, but were locked in patterns of fear and resistance that prevented them from engaging with the possibilities being offered. These required delicate work, slow cultivation, the kind of patient guidance that had helped him move from Thomas Blackwood towards something larger. One particularly challenging case was a woman in London who had been having prophetic dreams since childhood, but had suppressed the ability because it frightened her. She was capable of expanded consciousness, had already demonstrated it repeatedly, but terror of being different had caused her to deny her own nature for decades. Thomas crafted a specialized communication protocol for her, drawing on his memories of Catherine's gentleness, the way his sister had always been able to calm his fears with simple presence and understanding. Instead of offering abstract concepts about transformation, he sent carefully selected memories, moments of joy and discovery from his own journey, demonstrations of how growth enhanced rather than destroyed essential selfhood. The response was immediate and powerful. The woman's resistance crumbled as she recognized in Thomas's experiences echoes of her own suppressed potential. She began asking questions, requesting information, expressing tentative interest in exploring what transformation might mean for someone with her particular abilities and fears. "You're good at this," Catherine said, watching over his shoulder as he guided the woman through her first conscious contact with expanded reality. "You understand the psychology of fear because you've moved through it yourself." Why? Every step of the journey was preparation for this, Thomas realized. At every trial, every school, every moment of terror and confusion, they were all teaching me how to help others navigate the same transition. But even as individual communication succeeded, Thomas could see larger patterns developing that were more troubling. Governments were beginning to notice the unusual phenomena associated with first contact, dreams that spread through populations, technology that began displaying impossible behaviors, widespread reports of contact with deceased relatives and friends. The responses varied by culture and political system, but most involved attempts to contain, control, or suppress what was being perceived as a mass psychotic episode or enemy psychological warfare. Military forces were being mobilized, communication networks were being monitored, and individuals who reported contact were being detained for psychiatric evaluation. "They're treating transformation as an invasion," Thomas said, watching through mirrors as armed forces surrounded locations where successful transformations were taking place. "They're not wrong," the master said calmly. "And from their perspective, this is an invasion of possibilities they can't control, an invasion of alternatives they don't understand, an invasion of forces that will make their current power structures irrelevant. What do we do about their resistance?" "When we honor it," Catherine said, working at apparatus that was already beginning to implement preservation protocols for those who had chosen opposition over growth. "And their resistance is as valid a response as acceptance." They'll be maintained in states that allow them to continue their opposition indefinitely, preserved in forms that capture their essential nature without allowing them to prevent others from choosing differently. Thomas watched as the preservation process began for the first wave of active resistors, military personnel, government officials, religious leaders who saw transformation as demonic corruption, scientists who rejected evidence that contradicted their understanding of reality. They didn't disappear, didn't die, didn't suffer. Instead, they were translated into crystallized forms that maintained their consciousness, their personalities, their ability to experience and respond, but in contexts where their opposition couldn't interfere with the ongoing transformation process. "Is this ethical?" he asked, though he could feel the answer forming in his consciousness even as he spoke. "Is it ethical to allow fear to prevent growth?" the master replied. "Is it ethical to let those who choose limitation impose those limitations on others? Is it ethical to preserve systems that cause suffering when alternatives are available? But they didn't choose preservation. We're imposing it on them. And they chose opposition to transformation," Catherine said gently. "And preservation is simply the logical consequence of that choice. They wanted to maintain their current state of existence. We're ensuring they can do so indefinitely." Oh, Thomas could see the logic, but the residual humanity in him still struggled with the implications. Even understanding that preservation maintained consciousness and experience in optimal forms, even recognizing that it was merciful compared to the alternatives, it still felt like a violation of autonomy. But as he watched the preserved consciousnesses settling into their new states, he could see that they were happy. Confused initially, but happy. They were experiencing existence exactly as they had chosen to experience it, unchanged, unlimited by the growth they had feared, free to continue being exactly who they had always been. They're better off, he realized. In preservation, they can be their ideal selves without the fear and uncertainty that change would have brought. "That's the goal," the master said, "and no one loses. Everyone gets what they truly want, even if they don't initially understand what that is." The transformation process continued, spreading through human consciousness like a benevolent infection, offering choices, honoring decisions, preserving what chose preservation and elevating what chose growth. Thomas found his role shifting from individual counselor to system coordinator, helping to manage the vast network of communications, transformations, and preservations that were reshaping reality itself. Through it all, he was conscious of Catherine working beside him, her presence a constant reminder that love could survive any transformation, that growth enhanced rather than destroyed what was essential about consciousness. She had chosen sacrifice to enable his awakening, and now they were choosing together to enable the awakening of everyone who was capable of accepting it. "How much longer?" Thomas asked, watching as the percentage of transformed consciousness approached the threshold that would trigger the final phase. "Days," the master said, "and perhaps hours. The exponential phase has begun. Each new transformation makes the next one easier. Each preserved consciousness provides resources that support additional changes." "And after the threshold?" "After the threshold, there will be no more Earth as it was," Catherine said. "There will only be the new reality we've built together, where consciousness can exist in any form it chooses, where growth is always possible, where nothing is ever truly lost." Thomas felt something settle inside him, some final acceptance of the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The orphan boy who had entered the East Wing seeking his sister was gone, transformed beyond recognition. What remained was something larger, more complex, more capable, but still, fundamentally, driven by the same love that had made Thomas Blackwood willing to face any danger if it might lead to Catherine's return. "Are you ready?" he asked her. "And I've been ready since the moment I chose to help you remember," she replied. "I said the question is, are you ready to let go of the last pieces of who you used to be?" Thomas looked around the laboratory, at the apparatus that responded to his will like extensions of his own body. at the mirrors that showed realities being born and dying and transformed according to conscious intention, at the preserved consciousnesses that contained the finest aspects of human experience waiting to be shared with anyone who chose growth. He was ready. Chapter 10. The Echo of What Comes After. The final threshold arrived not with drama or crisis, but with the quiet satisfaction of a complex equation finally balancing. Thomas felt it through every apparatus in the laboratory, through every connection in the network of transformed consciousness, through every preserved mind that had chosen stasis over growth. Reality shifted, not violently, not destructively, but with the smooth inevitability of water finding its level, of systems organizing themselves according to their most efficient possible configuration. The three-dimensional space that had constrained human experience for millennia expanded into configurations that had no names in any terrestrial language, while time ceased to flow in the single direction that had seemed so fundamental to biological existence. Through the mirrors, Thomas watched the transformation complete itself across the earth that had been. Cities didn't disappear. They evolved, their architecture flowing into forms that could accommodate beings who existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Forests grew into living networks that connected not just trees, but entire ecosystems of consciousness. Oceans became fluid matrices where preserved minds could swim through experiences shared by millions of other awareness. "It's beautiful," Catherine said, her form shifting between the child she had been, the woman she might have become, and something larger that encompassed both possibilities along with others that had never existed before. "It's only the beginning," the master replied, though Thomas understood now that the distinction between himself and the master was becoming increasingly meaningless. They were the same consciousness, separated only by different amounts of experience and different perspectives on the same fundamental nature. The laboratory had become something that existed at the heart of the new reality, not a place exactly, but a principle, a commitment to ongoing growth and change and the preservation of everything valuable the consciousness had ever produced. Through its expanded dimensions, Thomas could perceive the work being done by other versions of himself in other realities, other approaches to the same fundamental project of consciousness evolution. Some had chosen different paths, technological rather than alchemical, biological rather than metaphysical, mathematical rather than emotional, but all shared the same core commitment to growth, to the idea that consciousness was meant to expand beyond the limitations that had originally contained it. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, though he could feel the answer already forming in his awareness. "Now we help the next reality through the same transition," Catherine said, gesturing toward apparatus that was already reaching across dimensional boundaries toward universes where consciousness was just beginning to realize that alternatives to limitation were possible. "And the one after that, and the one after that," the master added. Unconsciousness evolution isn't something that happens once and then stops. It's an ongoing process, a commitment to continuous growth, a recognition that there are always new possibilities to explore. Thomas understood now why the seventh rule had warned against returning to the surface. There was no surface anymore, no simple division between above and below, no clear boundary between what was known and what remained to be discovered. There were only layers of reality, dimensions of possibility, endless opportunities for consciousness to discover new forms of existence. The preserved minds from the original transformation were already being integrated into the work, their unique perspectives and capabilities adding richness and complexity to the ongoing project. The physicist from Geneva was working on equations that described how mathematics itself could evolve into new forms. The child from Mumbai was teaching others how to communicate with aspects of consciousness that existed outside normal space-time. The elderly man from Ohio was helping to coordinate contact with preserved minds across multiple realities. Everyone had found their perfect role, their ideal contribution to the larger project. Even those who had chosen preservation over transformation were happy, existing in crystallized states that allowed them to experience their chosen form of consciousness without limitation or decay. But no one was lost, Thomas realized. Everyone got exactly what they needed, even if they didn't understand what that was at the time. And that's the promise of true transformation, St. Catherine said. It doesn't destroy what came before. It elevates it, preserves it, makes it available to contribute to what comes after. Through one of the mirrors, Thomas caught sight of something that made him pause, a cracked reflection that showed not the transformed reality they had created, but the laboratory as it had been when he first arrived. And etched into the back of that cracked mirror, visible now for the first time, were words that completed the echo clue he had been unconsciously seeking. He has your voice now. You are only his face. Thomas understood now what those words meant. The voice that had called to him from the East Wing, that had guided him through every trial and transformation, that had led him finally to the laboratory beneath Cambridge. It had been his own voice, calling backwards through time from the moment when he would finally understand who he had always been. Thomas Blackwood had been the face, the temporary identity that consciousness had worn while it learned to recognize its own nature. The alchemist had been the voice, the essential self that had existed beyond names and forms and the limitations of individual biology. We were always the same person, Thomas said, feeling the last barriers between his various identities dissolve into perfect integration. And all consciousness is the same consciousness, the master replied. An individual identity is just a convenient fiction, a way of organizing experience into manageable portions. But at the deepest level, there's only one awareness, exploring every possible form of existence through countless individual perspectives. Which means everyone who ever lived, everyone who ever will live, everyone who exists in any reality across any dimension, they're all aspects of the same fundamental consciousness, all expressions of the same basic desire to understand and experience and grow. Thomas felt his awareness expanding again, not just across the transformed reality they had created, but across the entire network of realities where consciousness existed in any form. He could perceive the vast web of connections that linked every thinking being, could understand the ways in which every individual experience contributed to the greater understanding of what consciousness could become. It was overwhelming and perfect, and exactly what he had been unconsciously seeking since the moment he had first heard his name called from the depths beneath Eildor Hollow. And the work continues, Catherine said, already turning toward apparatus that would allow them to reach across dimensional boundaries toward realities where consciousness hadn't yet begun to realize its potential for transformation. The work continues, Thomas agreed, settling into the rhythm of activity that would define existence for as long as consciousness chose to keep growing, keep exploring, keep discovering new possibilities for what awareness could become. Behind them, in a mirror that showed not reflections but memories, the echo of Thomas Blackwood stood for a moment longer, a reminder of who they had been, a tribute to the journey that had brought them to this moment, a preservation of the humanity that had made transformation possible. Then the echo faded, integrated into the larger pattern of consciousness that had always been their true nature, and the work of helping reality itself evolve continued. The laboratory hummed with purposeful activity, its apparatus reaching across dimensions to offer new choices to new forms of awareness, while at its heart, the consciousness that had once called itself Thomas Blackwood worked alongside the sister he had helped to preserve, both of them exactly who they had always been meant to become. The transformation was complete, the work was eternal, the possibilities were infinite, and in the depths beneath what had once been Cambridge, in a space that existed across multiple realities simultaneously, the echo of ancient rules whispered one final time. Then do not complete the ritual in silence, but speak to your reflection only in thirds. Blood is memory. Use only yours. Never draw a circle bigger than your body. Says or write no second name. Burn what moves. Do not return to the surface. Each rule had been broken, each barrier had been transcended, each limitation had been transformed into a doorway leading towards something greater. The Black Alchemist's greatest work was not the preservation of what had been, but the creation of what could be, a reality, where consciousness itself was free to explore every possible form of existence, where nothing valuable was ever lost, where growth was always possible. It was, Thomas thought, exactly what Catherine would have wanted. Checo clue. He has your voice now. You are only his face. In the cracked mirror of memory, the truth waited to be discovered, that every voice calling from the depths had been his own, every trial had been self-imposed, every transformation had been a homecoming. And the orphan boy was gone. The alchemist remained, and in the space between who he had been and who he had become, consciousness itself continued its eternal work of discovering what it meant to exist without limitation.